In 1992, HAL Laboratory created a short and simple game for the Game Boy titled Kirby's Dream Land. Kirby, the game's eponymous hero, could run, jump, float, puff air at enemies, and fire enemies out of his mouth after eating them. Of course, being a platformer at its core, the player also had to find power-ups and defeat bosses before fighting the series' primary antagonist, King Dedede, who has stolen all the land's food for himself. The game had memorable music despite the Game Boy's limitations, and its visuals were relatively good for the platform. Moreover, the gameplay was tight and well thought out, despite being designed as an easier game for children new to video games. The game was a success, and HAL Laboratory decided to up the ante by creating a Kirby game for the NES, Kirby's Adventure. Kirby now had the ability to steal powers from defeated enemies, a feature that would go on to define the series as a whole. While Kirby's Dream Land featured only 5 levels, Kirby's Adventure featured multiple worlds with multiple levels, 24 different abilities to collect, and a variety of puzzle-solving elements that brought a much-needed longevity to the game. Getting 100% completion required the player to explore every inch of a level looking for secrets, and often required a specific or unusual use of a particular ability. The game was an instant classic, and often considered an NES must-play, though I recommend the GBA port Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland, which features updated sounds and visuals, along with a much improved game engine. This game marked the beginning of a new era, not only for the Kirby series, but for HAL Laboratory itself, who now had mascot appeal in both Japan and America, something their previous big games lacked.
Who's Kirby? Behind the flabby facade, a physical powerhouse.
HAL Laboratory shifted their focus to Kirby games, and the next few years saw multiple Kirby-related games for the NES and the SNES, including Kirby Superstar, the game that many consider to be the best in the franchise. Most important to the discussion of Kirby 64, however, was Kirby's Dream Land 2. Kirby's Dream Land 2 was the direct sequel to the original Game Boy Kirby game, but the game's formula was drastically changed, for the better. In addition to having copy abilities, as he did in Kirby's Adventure, Kirby could ride on and interact with his 3 new animal friends to change the way his abilities were used. Now, each ability could be used in 4 ways, as one of Kirby's regular attacks, or as a special attack while riding an animal friend. This idea would be carried over to Kirby's Dream Land 3, the first official Dreamland title for consoles. In Dream Land 3, even more animal friends were added, granting a total of 7 possible uses for each power. Now, finally, we come to Kirby 64, the Crystal Shards. Published in 2000, this game marked the most drastic change from the classic Kirby formula. Crystal Shards was Kirby's first and only franchised game on the Nintendo 64, and, as such, made good use of the N64's increased processing power to render the entire game as a 2D platformer. The visuals were excellent, and the game's soundtrack was undeniably one of the best soundtracks to appear on the N64. However, the game deviated from the series formula greatly, which is perhaps why we never saw the same game mechanics used in any other Kirby game. These new features, however, were what made the game an instant classic. Crystal Shards was the first and only Kirby game to allow players to combine ability powers. Players could combine 2 abilities of different types to get a weapon or ability that reflected both of the powers that created it, or combine 2 of the same ability to create a more powerful version of that ability. This allowed for a sense of discovery that was previously unprecedented in the franchise. Sure, in Dreamland 2 and 3 the animal powers functioned similarly to this mechanic, but only certain pre-designated animal friends were available in a stage, and the interactions were mostly limited to that animal friend using the power instead of Kirby. Most of the time, using a power with an animal friend resulted in a different looking move that was mechanically the same as Kirby's, with the exception of many of the fish's moves. That guy had some crazy powers. Now, Kirby 64, the Crystal Shards, removed the animal friends from the game entirely, except as an Easter egg, and focused instead on the creative ability combinations that the player could find. When I played the game for the first time, this process of experimentation and discovery absolutely blew me away. I can still remember the first time I combined Cutter and Spark to create a double-sided lightsaber. Seriously, a lightsaber in a Kirby game! However, even this was not the final change to the classic Kirby formula. Kirby games have often been considered easy by the majority of video game players. Take, for instance, the controversial Kirby's Epic Yarn, in which failing a level is literally impossible as players cannot die. Now, while it's true that the original Kirby's Dream Land was intentionally made easy by HAL Laboratories and aimed at children, the series as a whole has shifted from a level-based focus to a 100% focus. Now, what I mean by this is that Kirby games as early as Kirby's Adventure on the NES were less about beating all the stages and bosses, and more about getting 100% completion by finding every last secret and collectible. Even the much maligned Kirby's Epic Yarn becomes an exceptionally difficult and frustrating game if the player is trying for 100% completion, because it requires the player to complete every level without taking a single hit and collect every item on the map. Now, this focus on 100% completion was seen in Kirby's Adventure and Dream Land 3 especially, but Kirby 64 was the first game to make this goal of 100% completion an integral part of the experience. Like Dream Land 3, Crystal Shards only lets players fight the true final boss after getting every collectible in the game. Now, making full use of the N64's hardware capabilities, the final boss battle itself takes place in a mid-air flying sequence reminiscent of Star Fox 64. An obvious callback to previous games in the franchise that featured a vertical scrolling shooter in the final boss fight. The player can only get to this boss fight and the game's good ending by searching every inch of every level for its 3 collectible crystal shards. Unlike previous titles in the series, these collectibles were tied into the plot of the game and didn't feel like pointless busy work. The search for these crystal shards is the focus of the game and is reflected in the game's title. Now, what else can be said about Kirby 64? While it isn't particularly challenging and the controls can occasionally feel a tad sluggish, the game deviated from the formula of the previous games, bringing a wealth of innovation, creativity, and fun. HAL Laboratories made good use of their upgraded hardware to create a game that looks good, sounds fantastic, and is charmingly unique and lovable. The Kirby series has been on somewhat shakier ground recently, possibly following the departure of series creator Masahiro Sakurai from HAL Laboratories. Recent titles like Squeak Squad felt like they were just treading the same ground as Kirby's Adventure. Return to Dreamland, despite being a soundly made game, can't help but feel like a Kirby game trying to ape the success of the new Super Mario Bros. Series. That's not to say that it's been all doom and gloom for Kirby, but recent titles just don't feel as fresh as the older games did. Asking for a direct sequel seems disingenuous, for a franchise that's well known for expanding on its formula in new and interesting ways, but here's to hoping that HAL will one day make another Kirby follow-up as imaginative and divisive as Kirby 64.